Good morning, folks. My name is Darwin Brown. I'm the moderator for today's session. Today's session's number is T126, Note-Taking in the Digital Age. A couple of announcements before we get rolling. First of all, as a nicety to our speaker, please silence your cell phones and other electronic devices would be appreciated. There are two ways to evaluate this session. One is the hard copy, yellow copy you have at the ends of your rows. You can do that, just a hard copy. Again, session number 126, or you can use the electronic evaluation form that's on the PAEA app. And if you've not yet downloaded that app, I think you'd find it to be wholly useful during the conference itself. Let me get the introduction going. Again, note-taking in the digital age, we have Jason Grahame will be our speaker today. So please give a warm welcome to Mr. Grahame.
All right, well, thank you. As he said, my name is Jason Grahame. I'm an associate professor at Eastern Virginia Medical School. I'm also the director of admissions. Been doing that for the last 7-8 years, since 2007. I love technology, and so this is kind of an interesting segue for me to be able to present to you. I do thank the curriculum committee for actually inviting me back to give this lecture again. I presented it from last year, and there's been some updates in at least my thinking, which has been good to see it go from there. So. Let me just, as I mentioned, introduce myself. As I did, I'm Jason Grahame, and I love technology, as I said at the end. I do not have any financial disclosure to make. I do not receive any compensation from the pharmaceutical industry, medical product industry, or any other industries that I talk about today. I do love technology, but I don't have the iPhone 6 yet. My contract is not up, so I'm still using the old 5. So we're going to talk about define and describe note-taking throughout the years real briefly. I'm going to skip through that because as a good professor, I've crammed as much as I could possibly get into 50 minutes and will not be able to cover it all, but that's why I give you the notes to take home and read over. We're going to talk about the rapid infiltration of technology in education, the best practices, and this is really where I'd like to focus on student note-taking, because this is where I've seen some changes in some literature that's come out, which I think is important for us as we think about technology. We're going to compare and contrast the needs of professors and their students in terms of how we give them notes, how we give them information in our lectures as to whether or not we're doing them a service or disservice. And we're going to talk about, or at least introduce, several note-taking options for your students. This began as sort of a mandate from our program in 2011 when we came into a new building that we were going to go paperless. And so what we used to do before 2011 was to basically take all of our PowerPoints and print off the notes pages for them and distribute them. And as we began to grow in numbers, 50 copies to 65 copies to 80 copies, it became a little bit more of a budget issue. So we began to be required to submit all of our information via technology in some way. And this began to get me thinking. I just was at a Creative Commons lecture, and I'm doing another lecture tomorrow on intellectual property, which is what sort of stemmed me or sort of forced me into thinking through these topics and why I think it's important that we introduce these things to our students. So let's talk about note-taking through history. I found an interesting lecture series at Harvard that went at a 2-day conference on this, and it was a lot more academic than what I'm going to do. So if you'd really like some interesting thoughts and provoking topics and discussions, go to this website. They had some great stuff. But we could talk about a lot. We could talk about when writing began back in somewhere in 3100 BC. Certainly looks a lot like medical writing today. It's hard to understand and hard to decipher. Then we have the origins of sketchnoting, where we have hieroglyphics, where we draw pictures to depict what we're actually trying to look at. It kind of looks like modern-day infographics, if you're familiar with those in some sense. We have cave drawings, but those became hard to port from one place to the next if you were moving. So those got left behind, and it was hard to take your notes with you. We have the first tablet that was introduced a long time ago. It was great for actually recording information. It was permanent. You couldn't erase it, but it was prone to breaking if you dropped it. So that was not very good. Loose leaf papyrus came out, and it was easier to take notes and transport them, but it was hard to keep your notes together. And so notes from pathology would get mixed in with notes from anatomy, and it was a very difficult situation. The issue of scrolling came next, and we were able to actually combine notes together and actually have a huge document, but as the documents got larger and larger, it was hard to scroll from one place to the next. And then we move on to journaling, and again, taking things and putting them into small books, which allows you to keep your notebooks together. Then came mobile typeset, and we began a whole new universe of note-taking. Things were able to be reproduced with good accuracy and be able to distribute it to a lot of different people. And now we enter the digital age after a few thousand years of that printing. And now we have computers that are ubiquitous. We've now seen them everywhere into our pockets and into our cell phones, etc. This is what note-taking looks like today. Okay, this is a class of ours with everybody's got their notebook out and they are typing furiously. It's almost hard to speak over top of the fury of the keys if you're familiar with that. This might be the next wave of note-taking, where everybody waits for the notes to be taken up on the board and you just take a picture of it, and then you've got it for perpetuity and you can do what you want to with it. But as you are well aware, the technology has continually increased, and we are starting to see more and more of it start to infiltrate into what we are doing in the educational realm. For many of you, this may feel like what you think of when you think of technology. What goes with what? How does this incorporate? How do I get all these things untangled? Others of you may feel like this, that it's just an overwhelming tidal wave, and even somebody else put this picture together from a quote from the New York Times saying that we are in a technology tsunami. Whether you love it or hate it, ultimately we have to figure out how to survive and make it work for us. And that's where we are in education. Whether you're Apple or Android, technology is a given, not a debate. Your students will be using it, and we have to figure out the best way to engage them with it. Just in looking at how things have changed, this was something from 2010, and I'm sure it's even better now, but just look at the differences between these different things that we are commonly associated, that we know very well. Books published, 282,000 to over 1 million, and this is just in one decade. Daily emails went from 12 billion to 247 billion. In 2000, there were no iTunes downloads, and over 10 billion now, and that was in 2010. So again, this is starting to become more and more of an issue. So let's talk about note-taking best practices. What is it that we want our students to be able to do? And my question is this: what do you see are similarities between these two images? I would postulate to you that what we're seeing are individuals who have a body of knowledge that they need to communicate to a particular individual or group of individuals. And what I try to remind my students of is that your patients don't walk in with a PowerPoint of their history and physical and tell you everything that you want to know in a very logical, laid out fashion. Now, as a matter of fact, they're going to go through a question and answer, and typically we want to give them a time to explain what their symptoms are, and they're going to have to be able to sift through that information and be able to take good notes. Whether they're typing it or not is another question we'll get to in a minute, but both of these individuals, the teacher and the patient, are communicating a body of knowledge that needs to be communicated. Whether it's you agree with the sage on the stage or not, we still have a flare of information and a perspective on that information that our students need to hear. And again, those students, as healthcare professionals, as well as students, will need to learn how to take good notes. So why it matters. This particular article covered a couple of things which were very interesting. Humans forget over time. In 20 minutes, you'll forget 47% of what I say, which is why I'll give you good notes. In 24 hours, it'll be 62%. There's a little bit of a flat line there between 24 to 48 hours where you don't lose too much more. But then again, about 75 days later, you're up to about 75%. Only about 65% of students, according to their survey, take notes in class, which is quite interesting. They know that taking notes actually improves retention over even just listening. Here's the other thing that we have to keep in mind is professors that they mentioned. Professors speak at 120 to 190 words per minute. I'll probably even best that because of all the information I have to get through today. If you're typing, you can do a good about 90 to maybe 120 words per minute. But if you're actually handwriting, you're only at about 18 to 24. And that's not a lot of information. And so we'll talk about why note-taking is important. Interestingly enough, in this particular article, one of the comments that was made on this by one of the commenters underneath by the name of S.K. Lee, he was making a difference between note-taking and note-making, and outlining a difference between note-making where you're actually thinking through the information that you're writing down in such a way to actually make something with it. And he differs it between passive writing and transcribing and actually actively making something with it. And according to him, the acid test for good notes is whether or not you can explain that concept in your own words. And he also differentiates between what's core information and what's elaborative information. And he suggests that if students can understand what a professor or when a professor gives core information and can decipher that from elaborative information that supports that, they are much better at taking notes and are much better able to retain that information over time. So it was a very good article and again, worth reading through some of the comments below. So let's define note-taking. According to these three locations or resources, it's the practice of writing down or otherwise recording key important information. It's brief, It's especially one written down to aid memory. And it is also done in a systematic way. What it is not, if we were to define it by what it's not transcribing. It's not copying down every single word that the professor says. And it's funny when our students start to hear, and I want you to get this, there go the clickety-clacks of the keyboard, and it's amazing how much they're trying to transcribe exactly word for word. It's also not reformatting. What I've noticed, at least in our program when we went digital, was that a lot of students wanted to copy and paste their PowerPoint slide information into another document. And they were typically about 10 slides ahead of where the professor was. And so they weren't even really engaging with the information as it was being played out and presented. They were just simply reformatting the information, again, new fonts, new colors, but nothing really doing actively with the information. And it's not doodling, although I would say Jorge Munez, who is a student, a physician assistant student, actually did a lot of sketching when he was doing his PA education. And he actually has a website that I've referenced here that has a lot of great little caveats and cartoonish, comic ways of remembering different things. Even some of my own students have done this. This was done by one of our students who was trying to remember Virchow's triad. And there's an actual form of note-taking called sketchnoting, where you're literally drawing pictures that represent what you're trying to learn and remember. There's courses on how to do this, which is well beyond the scope of what we're going to do today. So here's the process. What these students are doing are listening to what's being presented or what's being given. They're doing that through a filter. And that filter is what's going to be important. And for some students, that's where they struggle. They can't figure out what's important and what's not. They are also recording that information, whether they're typing it or whether they're writing it. That's called encoding, when they're listening and then recording. And then they store that information in some organizational pattern, whether it's by outlining, whether it's by color coding. There's some organization that they're going to use. But the key is they have to do it quickly. Again, we speak fast. They can only write or type slower. And again, they have to do it, as according to Wikipedia, which we know is our best resource for this information. They actually call it an example of self-discipline, where you cannot write every single word. You have to be thinking as you're writing. All right. Good note-taking is much more than just fast writing. They listen actively when they write, they think while they listen, and they make conscious choices about what they record. They capture as much as possible, but they take notes that they can use later for effective learning, and more importantly, they review that information on a regular basis with focused attention. Again, they process it deeply, and they manipulate those notes to make them more useful. So that's the key thing that we need to get our students to understand, is that they have to be able to listen through a filter and actually be able to write down what's important. This particular study looked at what are the things that go into good notes and what are the things that come as a result of that in terms of outcomes. And again, I borrowed this from them to show you that this is what they postulate as probably the most likely things that go into good note-taking. They look at handwriting speed. They look at the sustained attention of the individual as they're listening, and then how well they understand the language, the comprehension. Maybe that's not just English language comprehension, but how about medical terminology language as well? What was interesting was that this is their postulation. These are the things that sort of went into note quality. What did not affect note quality was background knowledge. So having background knowledge did not necessarily mean that you made better notes. And then they looked at what are the outcomes from note quality. And they have known that for some time that written recall is better with good notes. Multiple choice memory type questions are better with good notes. And interestingly enough, inference and other inference measures were not as well associated with good notes. But what they found with significant and positive predictors was that handwriting speed did actually affect note quality, which again helped with written recall and multiple choice memory questions. So again, even knowing background knowledge is not necessarily going to help you make better notes, which I found very interesting. And at least according to their population, does not necessarily correlate with inference questions. Yes, sir?
Did handwriting speed actually encompass both handwriting and typing?
I don't think so. I think it was simply just handwriting for this particular look. So the Center for Research and Learning and Learning and Teaching at the University of Michigan did a research paper on good note-taking, and it came out in 2001, and it was excellent. It's a staple activity that's taken for granted. They found that students who record and review their notes do better on recall. They also do better with higher test scores both immediately and delayed after weeks or days or weeks. And they do better in recall and synthesis type questions. And there seemed to be a direct relationship between the quality, and at least for them, and those outcomes. And they found that it was better when they previewed these notes prior to taking the exam. even if they didn't come to the lecture and they reviewed somebody else's notes, they did better on the exam. Now, I'm sure that none of us are going to get rid of our attendance policy simply because of that. But it was interesting that even looking at somebody else's notes helped them in terms of their exam. The problems were that 40% of the important points were missed. Now, this was typically an average looking at freshmen through graduate school. It got better as you went along through your schooling education. But again, they were missing some key important information. Some more recent studies show that 90% of information is captured, but only of the main ideas, but only 11% of the supporting ideas. They oftentimes try to write down or record the visual things that we show, not so much the verbal things that we say. And when they do that, they tend to have more errors when they present that information on their notes, which is interesting. So diagrams, figures, equations tend to be misrepresented in their notes in comparison to what was presented in the lecture. So some things that we can do as faculty to help students understand the most important things are to, number one, boil them down for them in the objectives so that they know what's important, as well as to give key phrases and tell them what's important as we go along. Again, sometimes we have to get to the point where they can do that on their own because, again, patients don't always know what's important to present to them, and they have to pick up on that. For us, 135 words a minute, which I have no idea. I've never actually tested myself, so I wish that we had like a verbal speed gun where you could just have somebody in the back of the room kind of seeing how fast you're talking. But again, that's dependent on how much information we have to cover. I've got still another 30 slides, so I still have to pick it up. They also mentioned something called pausing, or one other reference I looked at said quick thinks, where you take a few minutes after presenting a little bit of information or a lot of information and give them 2 or 3 minutes to just reconfigure their notes. Look back over it, talk with their neighbors, see where they're missing information. They also suggest at the end of your lecture, giving them just an opportunity without looking at their notes to do a free recall. Say, I want you to write down on a piece of paper the top 10 things that you remember out of this lecture. And then go back and give your objectives or go back and look at the information that you've presented and tell them where they're missing or what's important to you as you look at it. You should also give some verbal and visual cues. Just give them some overview, your lecture style, whether you use an outline or not, but it's important to give them some visual cues. Some of the things that I do is I just continue. I use a little CONT on every one of my slides as I continue that along so that thought process is still there. Again, using your indentations and your hierarchies can be helpful in that matter. And give good breaks. So when I'm going to transition to a new topic, I'll put a new title slide in or something that's going to change it. You can change up the background of your slides. You can highlight words in different colors. Those kind of things can be helpful as well. One other thing to suggest is to maybe give handouts. For those of us who typically are now trying to be electronic and digital, we try to do that in a different way. One of the things that I've always struggled with is giving the created work that I've done as a PowerPoint presentation, carte blanche to my students in that PowerPoint file. So what I've tried to do is do more of Adobe, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But whatever you provide in your handouts, remember the visual things, the graphics, the charts, the equations are the things that they miss the most. So make sure that you give them those specifically as important things to remember. Give them a scaffold. I remember one of my history courses in undergraduate, literally the professor would walk in and would write about 20 terms on the board. That was his scaffold, and then as the bell rang, he would begin reading a 10-page document that incorporated every single one of those words at some point. The hard part was determining when do I make a break and how many lines do I leave for writing those notes down. But it's important to remember that we have to give them some scaffold and give them some information. So maybe you give them an outline. Maybe you give them something called guided notes, where you take out certain terms or leave spaces so that they can fill those in as you go. The downside to that, in my mind, is it makes more work for us in terms of professors. However, it does show that it can give them more information and help give them the guidance as to where we're going and how we're going. Again, use more complete notes. The more complete their notes are, the better their performance. Use headings and subheadings if you're using an outline. And again, make sure you give them the graphics, those tables, matrices, and diagrams. And again, if you use instructor notes, as I typically do when I make up my PowerPoint presentations, I'm happy to distribute those to my students. However, what I don't like to do is to give them in advance of the class, because what tends to happen is my students are 10 slides ahead of me, reading through what I've been presenting. And if you're any kind of an educator, I think you like to have some anticipation. You know, you're trying to work through a case, and it's no fun when on slide 2, the brainiac student on slide 10 says, oh, well, the answer is this. Okay, well, that wasn't for you. You've just short-circuited all the learning for everybody else in the class. So you want that anticipation as you're building a case so that you can reveal at the proper moment the information that you want. Okay? So I think that these instructor notes should supplement what you give the students, and I distribute it after class. One of the interesting comments or things that I read from the Boston Globe by a lady by the name of Ruth Grahame, no association to me, said that there is something such as called desirable difficulty. How many of you use the auto call feature or the favorites feature on your phone to call your parents or to call your best friend? And how many of you can actually tell me the phone number for that person, all 9 digits? 10 digits, excuse me. We use these features because they're easy, but we've short-circuited our memory so that I can't tell you what my dad's cell phone number is or my mom's cell phone number. I just know it's in my phone, okay? But desirable difficulty is a psychological principle described by Bork, who suggests that sometimes obstacles that frustrate us in our learning actually help us learn better and actually help us remember that information. So they've actually done studies to look at harder to read fonts, actually help the students remember the information more. It also helps your ophthalmologist when they can't see it well and they have to get better glasses. But it's important to know that we want students to have a little bit of difficulty in taking notes because I think it helps them remember it better. At least I think the research shows that. Human nature is to take the easiest route, but sometimes slowness and difficulty can add some value. And so rather than just giving them everything that I create, I like them to take their own notes and force them a little bit to have some difficulty when they're following me. So what are some student steps? Here are some things that you can tell your students that they need to be doing before, during, and after class. This was actually from the CRLT lecture, paper published by the University of Michigan, Dr. Zhu's work, and it was really, really good. And there's a lot of different resources that are out there. This was just one of the ones that I used. Before class, they need to skim the material. I don't mean, and again, in graduate education, we can't read every word. We can't read every prescribed or required reading. But we do want to skim the information for places of structure and how the chapter is laid out so that I have a framework that my teacher or my professor is going to actually fill in for me. I want to have some some logical organization to how I'm going to take my notes, how I want to do that. And I want to be fully engaged. If that means an empty bladder, if that means a quick cup of joe, or however that patient or that person's going to engage the professor, maybe even sitting in a different seat, that's going to be helpful for them so that they're engaged. During class, they need to listen for structure, questions, and repetition. They need to be completed and as accurate as possible in taking down those notes. So whether it's for them typing or writing, and again, we'll talk about that, it's going to be important. And again, use abbreviations, symbols, leave space for places where they know that they need to go back and fill in information. Some have suggested that if you're using loose leaf paper, that you leave the back side of the page completely free, so that if you have information that you need to add to your notes on the one side, you can add it over here. So again, they need to have some logical structure as to how they're going to keep hold of these notes. And again, for those that have a difficulty with organization, that's going to be the challenge, which we'll talk about as well. After class, and this is the key, they have to review their information. If they just put it on the paper and say, I'll look at it 2 weeks from now when the exam comes, that's not going to help them. They need to, within 24 hours, go back and review that information. As we mentioned, within 24 hours, you're going to forget about 47% to 67% of what I say. They need to look for gaps or confusion. And that's when I tell my students to go back and reread the textbook as to what they're confused about. If they already understand a couple of sections out of the chapter, rereading that's not going to be helpful. It's helpful when they go back and read for depth and read for understanding, but initially I tell them to skim. And then they can write questions in order to help understand the information, etc. And then they can reorganize it, whether they like to do concept mapping, whether they like to do outlining or charting, coloring. I tend to tell students not to recopy everything. They'll try to audio record the lecture, and then they'll go back and try to transcribe everything. Again, they're not actively listening and learning, they're actively transcribing. For those of you that are not familiar with it, the Cornell note-taking system is one way that you can take notes on paper that's been shown to actually have good results in terms of delayed recall as well. Some outcome studies with this from Wichita State University in 2008 compared this system with another. And again, although in an English classroom, maybe not correlated to sciences, it did show that it had benefit in cases where students were required to synthesize and apply the information. So they were actually required to, and it helped them learn. What you basically do is divide it into thirds. On the right two-hand column, two-thirds of the page, you write your notes. On the left side, you leave it blank. When you review your notes, you write key words, key questions, or key concepts in the left-hand side. At the bottom 2 inches, you leave yourself space to summarize all the notes in there in 1, 2, 3, or 4 sentences, and then it gives you a good study guide. You can go and fold over the one side and just leave your cue column and actually go back and use it as a study enhancement method. So again, there's a good way that they can actually do that on paper. So what I tell my students, in order to be successful, you read beginning with, and again, I put that in quotations in terms of skimming the material. You reread it afterwards. You record and summarize the information in class, and then you review it and review it again. Now, let's talk about technology in the classroom, because this is really where we've been forced to go just based off of how things have been progressing in the world around us. This is one option, obviously. Certainly, we can just have everyone turn off all electronic devices, and some programs and some classes do that because they're concerned about certain things. And I'm sure you're all aware we could talk about any one of these. Distraction. Most students feel, as they are digital natives, that they can simply multitask very easily. But as we know, which we'll talk about in another slide, you can't transfer from complex task to simple task and back without some decrease in your efficiency. This was one study off of this particular website that suggested that 54% of students that were surveyed waste a lot of time being distracted by other things on my laptop than what's being that they're doing. And then that they were also distracted by those around them who are on their computer doing other tasks than what was going on in the lecture. And this has been referred to as a cone of distraction, and I consider it to be a professionalism issue. As I see students who are doing other things, they may not be completely engaged, but they have just disengaged 4 or 5 people around them, and it's something to bring up to your students. They've actually come out with a hierarchy now of digital distractions and where things fall in terms of what teams to trump another. They've also been described as weapons of mass distraction. So there's certainly, we're well aware of these. One particular analogy that's been made is that it's similar now to the marshmallow test. If you're familiar with that test, it was done, I believe, back in the 60s. A gentleman took a marshmallow and set it on a table before a young cohort, 4, 5, 6-year-olds, and said, if you can have that marshmallow now, but if you wait 10 minutes, when I come back, I'll give you 2. And they marked those people and followed them all through their careers and actually found that those who were able, with the self-discipline, to say no, were actually able to do better in their education and careers down the line. Well, this is now the new e-marshmallow test. Can students actually concentrate on what needs to be done at the task that they're doing? And it's not as easy as we might think, but it is certainly something to consider. Again, here's the multitasking thought. Again, you can only do so many things at one time. And it typically takes you longer to do multiple things at once than it does to be concentrating on them at one point in time. And so again, telling our students that, yeah, if you're switching between your blog and your email, that's one thing. But to switch from taking notes in class to checking your email and then going back, you're going to run the risk of losing a lot of information that's being presented. And at some studies I've heard, it takes up to 20 minutes to re-engage in that complex task. That's not information, or that's not time that students have to waste, and certainly we don't want them to waste either. So what do we do with that? Well, the same group at University of Michigan has something called lecture tools, which I'm not going to talk a whole lot about today, but it is a very nice way to engage students in the classroom. And what they decided to do was, let's take technology and use it to our advantage as a professor. And there's a couple things that I like about it. But what they did is a study that looked at 16 courses that allowed laptops. 8 of those courses used lecture tools, 8 did not. They covered a wide variety of courses from sciences and math to English, and they were matched for size, level, and discipline. They had a 35% response rate, which is not great, and that was the number. Those were the numbers. What they found in the open comments were that students engaged by asking more questions. This particular platform allows you to chat questions to the lecturer that they can come and respond to later, or you can have a co-director responding to questions in real time. So they had better questions, and it allowed students who were a little bit more timid to ask questions that they may not usually ask or be engaged to ask. They had slightly higher grades, and they had better student learning. However, I asterisk that with the integration had to receive significant attention by the faculty. It's not enough for us to just throw laptops at our students and say, okay, take notes. We have to be engaged in how we use it, and we have to be very knowledgeable of how we use it in order to get those outcomes. The negatives were distraction, and again, in one case, it was actually negatively associated with their final grade as opposed to their individual module grades. So in this same study, 75% of students reported laptops increased the amount of time that they spent on non-course tasks. Excuse me. 35% spent more than 10 minutes per class on social networking and email. And in a 50-minute class, that's a long time. 40% or more were somewhat or significantly distracted by those who are using laptops nearby. And again, that's that cone of distraction that somebody sitting in front of you is off onto searching their next shoe purchase. You're sort of lost when you're talking about EKGs. And again, it's just one more added distraction that you as a student have to deal with. And I'll give you a way to potentially curb that. So laptops, according to the students, increased their attentiveness with this platform. Remember, this is lecture tools. 31% agreed with that. Laptops helped engage them in the class, almost half the students, and they actually, about 46% and more, felt that they learned more through that process. They felt that they were more efficient when typing. It gives them the option of actually looking at a slide and taking notes, typing those notes in next to it. Their notes seemed to be more organized because they were associated with the slide, and they would consider dropping a course if they didn't have access to this platform. And they felt like it helped taking notes a lot. However, engaging the students through the medium is what's important, and it does take a lot of effort on our part to make sure that we're giving them the tools necessary. But here comes the new information that came out this year that sort of has got me thinking a little bit more. What's the difference between writing and keyboarding? Interestingly enough, there's quite a bit. Writing actually engages something called the RAS that actually is the gatekeeper that allows us to filter out what's important to concentrate on right now and what's not. So when you're actually handwriting your notes, you're actually engaging the part of your mind that's going to actually help you decide what information to remember, what information not to remember. Versus keyboarding, where you're simply typing, does not. And in actuality, although you can take more notes and more copious notes, you do not necessarily get better benefit from it. And I'll show you that study in just a minute. The 2011 NHS study from England showed that children who write learn better than those who type. And again, the actual process of forming a letter with your hand and writing is different than just recalling the location of that letter on a keyboard and recognizing that letter. And so it was quite interesting, the study that they did. This study came out in 2014, in April, I believe, in Psychological Science, and they took 327 students in 3 separate studies. And what they did is they gave them a computer or pieces of paper, and the computer did not have internet access, just so that you're worried about if they were doing something else. And what they did is they said, here's a TED Talk of something that you may not be familiar with. I want you to take notes. And then we're going to do a recall test afterwards, and then 1 week later. But in between their immediate test, they also did 3 distractor tests where they actually taxed their working memory so that they would potentially forget the things that they had just heard in the TED Talk. The recall and conceptual questions were done 30 minutes later and then a week later. They found that the students that took notes on the computer or handwritten actually had equal factual recall. They did pretty well in recalling the facts. However, laptop users did significantly worse with conceptual questions and actually applying the information that was used out of that TED Talk. They did find that better notes or more notes equated to better scores, but again, the significant difference between those using laptops. What was interesting was that those who did laptops actually had better verbatim notes, and they had a significant congruity between what was said and what was written down. And even though they were told, do not transcribe the notes, we want you to think through this, they still had a hard time doing that. They still transcribed it. What they found, though, was that they were hoping that maybe a week later, with all those extra notes, they would actually do as well on those recall questions and conceptual questions, and they did not. It did not correlate to better outcomes. So longhand had more processing of the information. They had more permanent remembering and memory of that. And so the question then begs, well, are we doing our students a disservice by having them type their notes? And this is where I think some of the research is going to go, and they're already doing some research on, well, what about digital pens? What if you had a digital pen that you could take notes with and then transcribe that information directly into a digital medium? Because there are so many advantages with digital media so that you can actually search through it, or you can actually keep it or rearrange it much easier than trying to recopy notes. But I'm interested to see how some of these other digital pens and some of the research that's coming out may shed some light on that. So some other problems with computers and technology is the fact that they don't always work the way we want them to, and so computer crashes or power failures in the middle of text, in the middle of taking notes can be a problem. And so again, this may be simply just another way for our students to get stressed out and show them where they're weak and where they need to get better troubleshooting and stress management skills. So here are some suggestions that came out of the CRLT. One, set a policy and communicate it to your students. You can have it at the institutional level or at the programmatic level or even course specifics. Some are hybrids where we'll say, okay, at this particular time I want all laptops away and I want you to be thinking on what we're doing now. Other times it's an open access for laptops all the time. One of the other approaches is to have a laptop-free zone where you might sort of sequester the front 2 rows of your classroom where people who want to take longhand notes can sit and do not have to be distracted by those on their laptops around them. And again, if you have that as a policy, it may help as opposed to, I guess maybe it's the same in other schools where everybody sort of lays their claim to, it's like squatters in the classroom. If you touch my seat or if you're sitting in my seat, it's a problem. So if you have a policy, it gives them the opportunity to have that space. But anticipate the logistical issues with power failures, furniture configurations. Old desks don't really do well for today's laptops. Do you have enough adapter connections? Do you have enough bandwidth in your classroom to be online and have everybody doing this, especially if you're using something that's web-based like lecture tools? The dependence issue. I was just at a copyright lecture, and again, I asked for the permission to use Doonesbury's cartoon, but I couldn't get it, so I had to just, and cartoons just never do as well when you tell them. But this was the gist of it. Zipper is being asked in class what the 4 greenhouse gases are. His computer alerts him to this fact, and he says, "Staller while I Google it," okay? This is the one thing that I think we're all concerned about in terms of, well, if students are dependent upon information, just like we are dependent upon our iPhones or phones to actually remember the phone numbers for us, is that okay? I would suggest that it's a double-edged sword. One, Atul Gawande does a great job in his book on the Checklist Manifesto describing the amount of information that we are bombarded with on a day-to-day basis. None of us can learn it all, but we have to be able to know where to go to get the information so that we can make good decisions. However, in the learning process for our students, we don't want to short-circuit that learning process. They have to have the foundation before they can build on that with the data that's coming out. So again, we don't want to do a disservice to our students by allowing them to just Google everything and accept that that's going to be okay. I can only tell you how many times our clinical coordinators get calls from clinical preceptors saying they're always on their phone, I don't know why. Well, again, there's a generation gap sometimes, and they're just looking up information, but it's a perception that we have to be available of. Okay, so in the last few minutes here, let's talk about the note-taking options that are available to you. And again, I'm going to tip my hat a little bit because I'm old school probably, but I still like to write longhand notes. I am still struggling with how to take good notes on a computer. And this sort of as a prompt, this was actually my attempt at trying to figure out for myself, if I were in class today, how would I do it? And I'm still at the point where I think I would still take longhand notes, but I would want a way to actually digitize those, to coordinate those, and I'll show you some possibilities. But before we do that, let me tell you what I think are the needs of professors as well as students when we talk about who gets what. Professors need to communicate information that's critical, okay? And again, whether you believe in the sage on the stage or not, the point is we have a perspective on that information that the students need. We want to maintain their attention, and as I said before, we want to have an anticipation of what we're going to give to you. You probably already could have downloaded my notes already, and you could be already looking at what I was going to talk about. And that's how I'm deciding on to what my next lecture is going to be or where I'm going to go next, is what do I see in the PowerPoint. But again, I want to have a timely reveal for certain information that I want to hide from my students, that I want to be able to give them at the specific moment. And again, the other issue is I think we ought to have some copyright protection for the things that we create, and I'll talk about that more tomorrow. For students, they want to receive critical information, they want to have a way to organize that information, and they want to be able to manipulate and annotate, take notes on that information, and personalize it so that they remember it. And again, as we've talked about, there's some things that they can do to help remember these things. And in some sense, they like to be edutained. So again, those are some of the different specifics. And I personally tend to give my information in an Adobe PDF in order to protect a little bit of my copyright, but also to give them a little bit of that desired difficulty. And it tends to put me at odds with my students quite a bit, but that's okay. So here's some here's some possibilities. You could still do pen and paper, okay? And students still do this on many cases. We have students that print off all of their PowerPoints and come to class and take their notes there, which is certainly not a bad idea. It's fairly cheap, again, depending on where you get your copies. It engages the mind, as we mentioned, and it helps them remember some things better. You can customize it. You can reorganize your loose leaves. You can put them in notebooks. You can cut and paste if you really wanted to. But there's limited distractions. Yep. You can actually be focused on what you're writing on. The downside, corollary to that, is that you're missing potentially information being shown up on the screen, so you have to remember that. And again, better long-term memory and conceptualization of the concepts if they're taking good notes. The disadvantage, possibly writer's cramp, depending on how fast you speak or how much information is given. They miss the visual cues, and they can't get it all. But as I mentioned, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And again, for those who are organized challenge, they may have some difficulty keeping notes together, so they need to have some systematic way to do that. Some digital options, again, the LiveScribe pens, other digital pens that record the information and actually transfer it into a digital medium are interesting options. And again, tablets coming out have certainly been a huge boon to this, and there are some things I'll show you in terms of apps that you can utilize. You could give them the PowerPoint presentation, and that's what many of our professors do. They just give it to them and say, well, here you go, have at it, here's my notes. Again, I like to anticipate what I'm going to tell them. I don't want them to have all my notes just yet, because I may not get through all my notes. I might put something on there that I may not touch on, and I don't want to, I get a lot of questions. Is that going to be on the exam? So I try not to do that. The advantage is that you see what's on the screen that they're presenting. So you do get that advantage. It's customizable, it's familiar, you see it, you know it. The disadvantage is the keyboarding and the editing features are not very good. You can't easily highlight something. There's a lot of clicking and mouse movement. And again, you get into a rote pattern, not necessarily thinking about what you're doing. In terms of copyright, it can be cannibalizable, which I mean by that is you can take that content and move it to whatever they want to do, share it alike, put it out there, and there are concerns about that. There are organizational limitations, again, depending on how you save and what names you use, the formats and your folder structures. Again, students have to come in with some organization to do that. And again, I hate the fact that you can't surprise them with any good photos or the answer to the questions, those kind of things, unless you do a lot of legwork, taking those out, making a student copy of your presentation and giving them that. But again, all of us are pressed for time and it's hard to do sometimes. You can use Microsoft Word. You can actually do a digital Cornell note-taking system. You can make up columns. You can actually start to write down on the 2/3 side the information, come back and do cues. What I tend to see, though, are students copying their information from PowerPoint over to Word in a new cell and then reformatting it, but they're already 10 slides ahead and they're not really thinking about the information. Again, you do have keyboarding issues, organizational limitations, and again, the focus is more on formatting, I think, than they actually get on manipulating the information in a way that's important to them. How many are you familiar with OneNote? This is another attempt at Microsoft's ability to do a digital note-taking, and this has a lot of features. There are some really good things that I like with this. You can actually take a PowerPoint presentation and on your computer print to OneNote, and it'll put all your slides and all the information directly into a new tab in OneNote and allow you the function of editing. There's a lot more robust editing with this. It tends to try to be a one-stop shop for Microsoft, as again, a way to do web clippings, a way to do extra content, bulleted notes. So it's a fairly robust application on the computer as well as on a tablet. And it's got a quick, the one thing I really like about it is it's got a quick and powerful search engine. So if you can set it up where you have your course notebooks on one side for semesters and then your individual courses, and then you can add lectures below that on pages, you can type in the one search bar, whatever, femur fracture, and it will list every point in your notes from every course from anatomy through to clinical medicine where femur fracture is listed. And it's a very powerful search engine. So a lot of times our students use that in their fourth semester when they're trying to remember a concept that they couldn't remember out of anatomy. It's a really powerful search engine, which I really like. It's overwhelming, though. If you've ever played with it, it's not for a beginner user, and this is not something to introduce your students to on day one during orientation when they're overwhelmed with information, can't take good notes anyways, and then they're lost when they try to start using it. This is where you want to do some pre-planning in terms of getting this information to your students before matriculation so they can play with it and get comfortable. I find it not as intuitive as some of the other ones, at least for me, and being tech savvy, I find that to be concerning. And their free versions are limited to certain amounts of information. However, if you're buying a Microsoft platform for a student, it comes included with that along with some online access, which is really nice. Again, the OneNote tablet, there's cloud connectivity with it. You can access cloud information. You can access information on your computer. Again, there are some limited cloud options. The digital versus physical keyboarding, again, writing notes on a tablet is a little bit different than writing notes on paper, and I'm still struggling with that. It's actually how I'm taking my notes at this conference, and it's still challenging, but it's something to consider, and it's certainly an option. I do have some video links just to a couple of overviews for some of these, so you can check those out on your own time. Notability is another app that's oftentimes utilized or referenced in a number of different places. It has extensive options for editing. You can highlight, you can bold, you can underline. Again, there are some organizational challenges because it doesn't have a significant folder structure. It has 1 or 2 levels, and that's about it. It can access multiple different cloud sites. So if you're a student that has clouds with iCloud, or you've got cloud information with Dropbox or any other of those, you can access those. The good news is there's no inherent storage or upload limits. You're not limited to a certain amount. And you can actually add photos, sticky notes, web clippings right into your note on your tablet, and it's fairly nice. It does have some hand recognition and a little bit of handwriting options. There's no PC counterpart yet, so it's a standalone app for iPhone. I don't believe they have it for Android, but they do have a Mac version coming out, so you can actually access it on a Mac and actually sync between those two, which is kind of nice. There's no task list option, little check boxes where you can check off things, but that's probably coming. And the learning curve takes a little bit of time, as with any of these, so I encourage the students to get used to them in advance. There was actually a Notability review for med school by a medical student who actually says, this is how I use it. And there's a lot of resources out there that you may want to scour the web for and actually include on your orientation for your students if they want to use some of these things. Evernote is another one that allows cloud access, add photos, again, very similar. They have their own little microculture. They have their own little notebooks and pens and a whole little microculture that goes along with it. The downside is that there are limits to their free version, and there's no cloud accessibility. Everything that they store or that they remember for you is on their cloud service. So if you're kind of worried about, well, where's my information going and who has access to it, you can't determine which cloud you sync to. It's only theirs, and that's it. And their premium does cost, but it's nice. A lot of people use it, et cetera. This is a new one that I've come across that I really like. It's called PDF Expert. It's basically just for the iOS system. But I can upload a PDF to this document. I can add pages to my PDF and take notes. It's got hand recognition. It can sync to a ton of cloud services. Any cloud services out there, you can get to this. You can actually make a connection to your PC over the web through a Wi-Fi connection and simply drag in or upload content directly from there. I've downloaded the PowerPoint presentations from the sessions I've attended so far. I open them in this, and I can do a lot of editing. There's a few things that you can't do, like adding pictures, but they are very open to suggestions and have done a number of different things. There's some other corollaries. Goodreader is one that's available as another alternative to this. iAnnotate and Zoto are actually also on both iOS and Android. But I really like this particular one. It's made a significant improvement in just how I take notes. And again, if I want my students to have a PDF copy of my PowerPoint and be able to mock that up without having to recopy or reformat, this I think is a great option for them. And it costs a little bit. It's about $10, which is a little expensive, but they have some other apps as well where you can print. They have other printing apps. They also have a PDF scanner, so you can take any document and turn it, or anything, and turn it into a PDF, and then use their PDF Expert to actually mock it up and annotate. Here are some additional resources that I would recommend to you. The University of Michigan Med School has a great website that allows you to get into how their students are using these things in their own classes and how they're using different applications for that. Edudemic, Connecting Education and Technology. This was a really nice site that had a lot of information on those on connecting technology with education, both from high school into undergraduate and even into graduate. So in the end, I would suggest to you that you need to choose wisely. It's not what technology does to us, it's what we do to technology. Get smart with technology, choose wisely and use it in a way that benefits both you and those around you. We certainly don't want to end up with this. There's only 1 minute left, but could you repeat your entire lecture for me? So getting your students to take good notes now is really, really important. And to sort of tip my hat, as I said, I'm still struggling with this transition to the digital world. And even though I'm only in my 30s, I've grown up around it, it's still a transition for me. However, in the end, I would say that there are still some applications where paper has the edge. All right. I'm happy to entertain any questions. We are short on time just in terms of the noon hour, but I'll be happy to stick around and answer any questions for you. I'm also happy to give you a PDF copy of my lecture notes. If you're interested in that, please send me an email. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to entertain a couple if anybody has one. 72 slides in 50 minutes, not bad, huh? All right, thank you.